Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. So Grady and I are going to tag team this presentation and tell you a little bit about the secondary crash research that we just wrapped up for Federal Highway. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of information. This report, the final report, is in publication review and hopefully will be out soon. But so we're just going to give you an overview of the research, what our objectives were, define a secondary crash, talk about the data that we collected, how we analyzed the data, and then took a little bit deeper dive into some case studies of particular secondary crashes. Excellent. So there's have been in the past a lot of anecdotal information about secondary crashes, like what's the percentage of secondary crash, how serious are secondary crashes, what circumstances do they occur in. But until a few years ago, there wasn't really a lot of data to back up some of those statements or assumptions. And so the objective of this research was to take more recent data that was available on secondary crashes and try to just back up some of those statements and assumptions with data, and then also take a deeper dive into one or more states, and based on the information or the findings from the data assessment, try to look at particular crashes that occurred and how they could be potentially mitigated through countermeasures. So definition of secondary crash was set a number of years ago with the Focus States Initiative. So a secondary crash is defined as a crash that occurs within an incident scene or within the queue or backup, including the opposite direction resulting from an original incident. So this could be an original crash, a primary crash, which is the way I think a lot of states and even Federal Highway as a simplification has suggested a crash-to-crash relationship, but recognizing that secondary crashes can also occur from non-crash incidents such as debris in the road. Next slide. So as I mentioned, more recently, there have been more data available on secondary crashes. Back in 2017, the MUC 5th edition added a secondary crash data element. It's shown there on the right. And many states have, over the last 6 years, have started to add that data element or a similar data element to their state traffic crash reports, and have begun to attempt to collect this data so that we have more information on crashes that are secondary in nature. So our approach was to gather data from a number of these states that have added this data element, and then try to uniformize that data across the states, recognizing that states have different crash reports. They define things sometimes differently. And there was a big effort to not only collect the data from the states, but then standardize that across the states so that we could do some analysis. We also did a spatial temporal analysis to try to match the secondary crashes that were flagged in the data that we got from the states to a primary crash candidate, so that we were fairly confident that the crashes that we were analyzing were secondary. And then we did some analysis and developed some case studies. So that we received data from 10 states. The data that we received from the states, there was nearly 52,000 crashes marked as secondary. This was over a couple million crashes. And those about 52,000 crashes are shown in the states on this map. So you get an idea of the distribution of the states and kind of the distribution of the secondary crashes. You can really see them along some of the major roadways, especially in the more rural states. And then in the states in the east, there's more clumps, but a good deal of secondary crashes. And one more clip, Luana. These were the locations that we were able to find in those crashes where we were able to find a crash that we felt was a primary crash candidate. So we actually have that crash to crash relationship for about 15,000, a little more than 15,000 of the crashes. And those were the crashes that we focused on for the analysis. So this is just a quick breakdown. One of the things I think many of you have probably heard in the past is that up to as many as 20% of crashes could be secondary in nature. We didn't really see that in the data that we collected. This is a breakdown of the number of crashes that were marked as secondary in each state, and that number divided into the total number of crashes for the same time period that we received from the state. Ranged from about 0.25%, 0.28% up to a little over 3%. So on average, just about 1% of the crashes. That number goes down when we try to make that crash to crash relationship to fewer. So just kind of put that percentage of secondary crashes into perspective a little bit, significantly less than some of the numbers that have been thrown around in the past based on the data. Next slide. So we focused on those about 15,000 crashes that we had that crash to crash relationship, and we did some descriptive statistics. We looked at the secondary crashes by a lot of different factors. So next slide. This slide shows by time of day. This follows a typical volume pattern, and so I don't know that there's anything really here that jumps out other than the more vehicles that are on the road, the more secondary crashes following that sort of morning and evening peak, and then lowers overnight. Next slide. Looking at secondary crashes by day of week, we do see that Fridays kind of pop up, and that Saturdays and Sundays are fewer, which is kind of interesting. Whereas like Monday through Thursday, it's about the same number of crashes, but there does appear to be a little bit higher number of secondary crashes on Fridays. Looking at roadway type, this isn't, I don't think, too surprising. A large number occur on interstate highways or other freeways, but we do see that we're capturing it through these crash reports, capturing secondary crashes that occur on arterials, principal and minor arterials, a few on collectors, and even a few on minor collectors. Looking at severity, while you have all kinds of injury severities, most of them, the large majority, have no apparent injury, but a few fatals and suspected serious injuries as well. So this is another one where I think sometimes it's thought that maybe secondary crashes are more severe in nature, and while we do see those, most of them really don't involve an injury. Looking at weather conditions, and if you recall the map, we do have states with winter weather conditions included in the data, and we hear a lot about multiple secondary collisions occurring in winter weather conditions where the visibility is reduced and the pavement is slick, and we do see 265 occurring in snow conditions, but most of these are occurring during clear conditions during the day, or clear conditions at night, or partly cloudy. So most are occurring in non-inclement weather conditions. Same with lighting. Most of them large majority are daylight or dark lighted. So because we connected, we matched a secondary crash that we had in the data. Most states, the only state that we had that had a connection between a primary and a secondary crash was Wisconsin. So in most cases, we only knew that this was flagged as a secondary, but we didn't know what the primary crash or primary incident was. So that's why we did that matching to try to find the primary. And what this does is this chart looks at the distribution of the time between the primary and the secondary, and it shows that a large majority actually have the exact same time. The primary crash and the secondary crash that we've matched have the exact same time. And which says that, you know, a lot of these crashes are happening bang, bang. So probably before responders are even able to get on the scene, a lot of these secondary crashes are occurring. And then there's a long tail out to the right up to a couple of hours after the primary, and you see the spike at 60, and you see kind of the up, down, that's really rounding to 5, 10, 15, 20, et cetera, minutes with that spike at 60 and another spike at 120. So that just captures some of the human nature of the data that's being collected, but shows that these secondary crashes, a lot of them occur just back to back. And this slide is the same idea, but the distance between the primary and the secondary, same thing. A lot of the secondary crashes had the exact same GPS coordinates as the primary crash that we matched it to. And then you have the long tail up to about a little over a kilometer back, but most are happening very, very quickly and within very close proximity to the primary crash. So with that very quick overview of the data, I'm going to turn it over to Grady to talk a little bit about the secondary crash typologies and the case studies that we developed.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelley. So this is really a very interesting study, having looked at about 52,000 secondary crashes and more than 15,000 primary events that were linked with those secondary crashes. So the descriptive statistics that Kelley was able to show you really kind of paint a picture of what's going on with those secondary crashes. But we wanted to do a little deeper dive. So what we did is we took several hundred of those crashes, and we looked at and analyzed the report narratives and diagrams from the actual police crash reports, and we created some coding to go along with those reviews of those narratives and diagrams. So the first thing that we came up with is this grouping of what's going on and how are these secondary crashes happening. And the first one there, the type 1 example, is the one that readily comes to mind for everybody, and that's the rear end crash that happens upstream of our incident or maybe right next to our incident. The crash with a vehicle involved in a prior crash, that is one that again was very common in the data. It's that bang bang type of situation that Kelley described, where there's a crash, and then within just moments or seconds there's another vehicle running into that crash at the original scene. Vehicles versus fixed object was again something we saw a lot in the data. People are approaching these scenes. There's a sudden slowdown. They're trying to avoid things, and they lose control, and maybe they strike a guardrail or a barrier or a pole or other things. Debris from prior crashes is not real common, but it does happen. It was significant enough to make it a typology. Lane changing, people are coming up on our scenes and they're having to shift lanes to, again, navigate around our incident. And in the process of doing that, a lot of times they'll kind of get into each other in this side swiping, same direction side swiping type of arrangement. And then the last one, type 6, is the one that we all worry the most about, and that is the responder struck by incidents where a vehicle is approaching our scene and they run into one of the responder vehicles, or even worse, as Jim mentioned earlier in our struck by statistics, they hit one of our pedestrian responders. So those are our types 6 typologies, and what we want to do is just kind of do a deep dive and look at some examples where some of those types kind of present themselves. Next slide. So the first case study that we want to share with you today is out of the Central Florida area in Orlando. And what happened on this particular day was a wet roadway, and it was light traffic in the early morning hours, and a series of crashes actually happened. And this is oftentimes what happens with these secondary crashes. And not only is there one, but there are sometimes multiple secondary crashes. So here's a timeline and kind of a description of what went on here. And over on the right hand side of your screen, you see an aerial view of the roadway during this time, and kind of that spatial distribution of where these crashes happen. So the first one happens around 7:43 in the morning, vehicle driving down the road loses control, hits the wall, winds up partly on the outside lane in the shoulder, and another vehicle comes along and loses control as well and hits that first vehicle. About then, we get some responders on the scene. They start setting up some traffic control. The crash report times are the ones listed here, but we kind of figure there's probably a little bit of difference in the actual time. But around 7:50, we've got some traffic control set up. We've got some arrow boards out there. And that's when, again, vehicles are changing lanes and they get tied up. And then they wind up kind of sliding all over the road and hitting one of our responder vehicles. While this is happening, a little further upstream, that collision number 3 at 8:20 a.m. So we've been on the scene now for about 30 minutes, and this is where, again, another vehicle loses control and a single vehicle crash occurs. More traffic congestion happens after that, and in that queue, there's a rear end collision that happens. Next slide. So here's kind of a sequence of the events. So we'll click through these just to kind of show you what's going on from those crash reports. So the first, here's the roadway segment that we're talking about. And so that first crash occurs, and it's this Lexus that's driving along. We'll go ahead and click up to that, and they spin out and hit the guardrail on the right side. And they actually wind up facing the wrong direction over on the right side of the road. Next slide. So here is that first secondary crash. Driver's driving along in the outside lane, sees something up ahead, decides to change lane, gets a little squirrely because, again, this roadway's wet. And there's a slight curvature to the roadway, maybe misjudged their speed, got a little out of control and wound up going over and striking the first vehicle and striking the guardrail. Next slide. So here's where we get on the scene. We put up our cones and our arrow boards. That vehicle 3 that's in the lower center part of your diagram there is the road ranger that's on scene with an arrow board. And you see vehicle 1 and vehicle 2 coming around the corner in lane 2 and lane 1. And again, there's a lane change that is attempted. The vehicle loses control, hits the other vehicle. They both wind up going into the traffic control area, temporary traffic control area, striking the wall and striking our road ranger. Next slide. There's our next single vehicle, a little further upstream. The road still curves further upstream, but you can see here there's no guardrail. It's concrete wall back there. Hits the inside and then goes out to the outside and comes to final rest. That creates a lot of onlooker delays, and that's when traffic starts backing up. And the last crash that we see happens. And let's pop that diagram up there. And that's your typical rear end collision in the upstream area. So let's click on forward now. We'll see, we're lucky enough to have an actual video. So there's our road ranger set up, law enforcement's there, and these are the vehicles that intrude into the scene. And again, just, careless folks, light traffic, on a morning with a little bit of rain, and you can see they just get out of control and strike our responder vehicle. All right, let's go ahead. Next slide. So to wrap up this one, we had 4 secondary crashes. Now, we learned from our data analysis that a lot of times these secondary crashes, matter of fact, the majority of the time these secondary crashes do not involve injuries. But in today's example, with these 4 secondary crashes, we actually had 3 of the 4 involved more serious injuries, and all 3 of those required transportation with incapacitating injuries or non-incapacitating injuries in the 4th one there. So not too serious of injuries, but enough for them to take a ride to the hospital. Next slide. So the next case study is the southern part of Florida, down around the Stewart, Fort Pierce area. And this is about 4:50 in the morning. This is on Interstate 95. There's a large truck driving along, and he's not paying attention. And the truck, pickup truck in front of him is driving a little bit slower. doesn't really perceive that there's a danger until the last moment, and he rear ends that pickup truck, goes off to the side of the roadway, off to the right, hits a light pole, goes down the embankment, and comes back up on the other side and hits a fence. So a lot going on here with this crash. Fortunately, there were not a lot of serious injuries here in this first event, but it did cause that light pole to fall down on the outside lane of the roadway. And again, that bang bang type situation, a vehicle comes along in that right-hand lane and hits the light pole that's down in the road because it had literally just fallen in front of them. We get our responders on the scene, and they set up a pretty nice traffic control. Let's go ahead and click forward, and you can see the traffic control that's set up. So we've got a couple law enforcement officers on the scene. We actually had 3 arrow boards out here. We've got the right lane of 3 lanes blocked. They did a nice job of setting up a good protected area with a lane +1 to give all these responders a little extra room to work. We've got that pole that they're dealing with. We've got this vehicle that's off the roadway that's going to have to be recovered with a heavy wrecker. But what I want you to focus on is in the inside lane, lane 1, you see that white van with the ladders on the top. That's the guy that's going to come along and cause things to really get ugly here. The vehicle in front of him is an Audi, Audi sedan, and that Audi's going to check up a little bit, going to slow a little bit, and that van is not going to slow. We're at we're clipping along at pretty close to highway speeds here. It's free flow conditions, and he's going to get into the back of that Audi and send it right into our scene. So let's click forward and see the video from that. So what see here is he's hit the back of that Audi, and that Audi has come into our scene. Trooper pushes the person out of the way. Again, they're over on the shoulder, and for the sake of just for the sake of not wanting to expose anybody to anything too terrible, I paused the video here, but the trooper does get struck, requires transportation. Trooper's out of commission for several months, but was able to come back to work. So again, let's click forward and take a look at what happened here. So there's your primary crash, no injuries. Secondary crash, car hits the light pole, and again, no injury. But that next one that came along, after we're there and we've got all this elaborated traffic control set up, is when again a vehicle hits another vehicle and sends it into our scene and into our responders that were there. Next slide. So some of the findings, I think, to summarize the research that Kelley and I worked on, we found that mostly interstates, principal arterials, urban areas, and clear weather were present. A lot of times these don't involve injuries, but when they do, they can be pretty serious and fatal. 2/3 of them are front to rear. It's that classic rear end crash that we all know about for secondaries. 10% though are the same direction side swipe, and 10% are single vehicles. Close proximity to our initial crash, happening at the same location and happening in close proximity in time. A lot of times these secondaries are happening before we're even there, before we're on the scene. But that doesn't mean that TIM is not a good strategy to prevent secondary crashes, because we know that once we get there, if we can do the things that we do, we can make it safer, but we can't always make it bulletproof. So we've got to be constantly on alert and on our situational awareness and making sure our head is on a swivel. Next slide. So as far as data goes, as far as secondary crash data goes, we really would like to see better linkages between that primary and secondary event. If we can actually have the report numbers in the opposing primary and secondary reports, that would be very beneficial for researchers like us to go back and pull the two and marry them up. We think that while we did this analysis combining 10 states and 52,000 crashes, we think you can do a lot with your data at a state level if you're collecting this particular type of data. So we want to encourage regional and state analysis. When we do try to combine it across states, it gets a little bit tricky. A lot of these data elements and attributes don't always line up. Even though there's national guidance, there is no national mandate that data look the same and be structured the same. And then quality and completeness of the data is always something that we really would like to see improved. So we really want to challenge and encourage our law enforcement to do a better job of documenting the facts of these secondary crashes and hopefully putting details in those narratives and diagrams that can help us down the road. Next slide. So that kind of summarizes our presentation, and we thank you for giving us a chance to present.